Hi. We come to the end of this long section that we began in chapter 9, verse 1, with Saul looking for his father's donkeys and finding Samuel and being made a king. Sort of, maybe. But it will happen a little more last time when the people proclaimed, "Long live the king," even though he was not named, Saul was not named. And there's going to be more to it yet to come. So today we're just going to look at 2.5 verses from 10:25 through the first part of verse 27 to finish this up, because there's a lot going on there. And then, as you can see on the left side of the screen, but he held his peace in verse 27, now we hear about Nahash, king of the Ammonites. And really that's a brand new section, and we'll continue through chapter 11. So we'll end there in the middle of verse 27. As you can see on the right side of the screen, verse 25 is the end of Samuel's experience at Mizpah, having gathered the people together in many ways, as we looked at last time, punishing them by giving them a king, punishing them for the rejection of Yahweh. And now we come to something else. And even though we're only going to look at a couple of verses, there's a lot of curious details going on here and things that might not meet the eye unless we look more closely. So let's jump right in. As we hear from our notes here, from Halberstall and Holmes, in my note down below, they summarize this. In this oddly graceless coronation ceremony, distinguished by Samuel's residual resentment and Saul's embarrassingly humble demeanor, a handsome but ambitionless king designate was grudgingly enthroned. That's an important way to put it, and that's a little bit we saw last time. But now Samuel's not talking about Saul in particular. He's talking more generally. And so let's look at the language and hear exactly what's going on. The New RSV, as you can see, says, Samuel told the people the rights and duties of the kingship, and he wrote them in a book and laid it up before the Lord. Then Samuel sent all the people back to their homes. But this phrase, rights and duties of the kingship, in Hebrew, mishpat, hammelukah, is not simply melech, which is the king, but kingship or monarchy itself. And the question of rights and duties as a translation of mishpat is also a little bit problematic, as we'll see in just a moment when we look at another set of translations. In fact, let's just look at that now, because there are two things at issue here, as you can see. One is how to translate mishpat, and the other is how to translate melukah. And so in the New RSV, we hear rights and duties and then kingship. But if you look at these other translations from the Contemporary English, King James, the New King James, New American Revised Edition, New American Standard, the New English, the New International Reader's Version, and the Contemporary Jewish, those are the ones we see there, we see this variety. So in the Contemporary English, rather than justice or rights and duties, we hear operate, how it should operate, and it's speaking of monarchy itself. But in the King James, we hear the manner of the kingdom. Whatever manner means there. Is it about etiquette and manners or the way a kingdom should operate? That's a little vague. That's revised in the New King James by the behavior of royalty, and as we'll see, that's how it's word by word translated in Bible Hub too. So there it's about the king, not the kingdom or the monarchy. Notice there's three possible ways to interpret that. The king himself, the kingdom, which is to say the geographic area, and the monarchy, which is to say the institution and the bureaucracy itself. And it seems plain to most scholars that king is wrong, but that doesn't stop some translators from rendering it that way. And so then we continue down the rules of the monarchy, like this was, Samuel was like the referee or the rule maker establishing how the game is played. In the New American Standard, we see ordinances of the kingdom, so ordinance is a little more formal than rules. The New English has it more vaguely, how the kingship would work. More practical, rather than, it's more like an owner's manual than a legal book. In the New International Readers, we hear rights and duties of the king, like we see here, except king rather than kingship. So it's more about the personal issues of the king rather than how the monarchy or kingship should operate. And then the Contemporary Jewish, we hear what kinds of rulings should be made, making it sound like it's purely judicial, not about establishing the laws themselves or the rules themselves, but about judicial decisions, as if the kingship and the monarchy is just another version of judges. But it's not, and that's important for us to be seeing. So let's look, as I noted here in the interlinear, it says the behavior of royalty, which is kind of nice, but maybe not as precise as others. If we look at the word mishpat, we can see that the word mishpat in my note down below is 424 times in the Masoretic text, so a very important word, 86 times in the Deuteronomistic history, the books from Deuteronomy through 2 Kings. But in 1 Samuel, it's not again until 27:11. And so while we're down there, we can see my note from Barbara Green, who notes, if the mishpat hammelukah is to be equated with the referent of Deuteronomy 17:17-20, and with the fundamental charge recited by Samuel in 12:14-15 and 20:25, 12:20-25 that is, which we'll get to soon, then Saul stands with hands at his side as the prophet takes on the kingly task. In other words, if this is meant to be following Deuteronomy 17, then there's not much for the king to do except be obedient to others, which Saul is a good candidate for, as we've seen, since he was obedient to his own servant boy and to the watering girls, and he's certainly been obedient so far to Samuel. But whether it is meant to evoke Deuteronomy 17 is an interesting question, so let's continue further on. So Samuel told the people this, and one of the questions we should ask is, where is Samuel getting it from? Is he just making this up? Yahweh, as far as we know, has not told Samuel how the king should act or how the monarchy should act, or if we translate it in the way mishpat is often translated, the justice of the monarchy, which is to say how people will be treated in right relationship during a monarchy, given the warning in chapter 8, verses 11-17, that the king would take, and leave people bereft, and that Yahweh would not answer him when they cried out for relief. So whether we hear it as justice or the game plan or the bureaucratic rules makes a huge difference here. And whether that's to be compared to Deuteronomy 17 is another. But again, the question of authorship. In Deuteronomy, at least, it's ostensibly Moses got it from Yahweh, and that's what makes it what people should listen to. But there's nothing in the text that says where Samuel's getting this from. Nor are we told what those details are. We're just told the fact that he told the people this, and then he did something even stranger. He wrote them in a book and laid it up before the Lord. And so we see he wrote it in a book. Sefer is the word for book, but there's been no indication of literacy so far in relation to either the prophetic or the monarchic office. And there's not any more talking about writing in a book in the rest of the first book of Samuel. When we get farther into the books of Kings, which we're not going to do in this set, you can see down below that 61 of the 83 uses in the Masoretic text of Sefer for a book are in Kings, because by that time we're dealing with a very literate culture, and certainly the scribes who are writing the Deuteronomistic history, writing the books of Kings, are capable of writing in a book, and they make reference to other specific books like the Annals of the Kings of Israel or things like that. But this book doesn't have a name, and it's the first time we have any sense that Samuel has literacy, which in the ancient world was a rare thing and not something that priests necessarily had. That's what certainly in later times scribes are for, as a separate category from priests or prophets or others, to be the people who carry the technological gift and skill of literacy to do that for the king and for others. But Samuel is a bridge figure between all kinds of types. We've seen him do priestly things and offer sacrifice, which we'll see some more, and we've already seen, and we've seen him act judicially like a judge, and we've seen him speak prophetically and speak clairvoyantly and all kinds of things. So Samuel is a man for everybody, and yet in the end will be a man for nobody, because he will not have any power after this scene here. Well, after Saul is done, not quite this scene, but after chapter 15, as we'll see. And so this book, wherever that book is, and laid it up before the Lord, literally put it in front of Yahweh's face. And how are we supposed to imagine that? There's not a temple at this point. Deuteronomy, at least some version of it, is ostensibly found by one of the scribes of Josiah in 2 Kings 22, and there it's discovered as a quote-unquote old book. It's understood to be something ancient, although that's probably a fiction by the authors. But at least there it's ostensibly a book found in the temple and written by Moses on behalf of Yahweh. But this is a book that has no particular place to go. As we've seen, the main cult center was in Gilgal, but Samuel's not in Gilgal. This is still in Mizpah, and there's no particular reason to think it would be laid up in Mizpah. But there it is, in front of Yahweh's face in this place. But does that mean the people have access to it? Who would have access to this wherever it is? We never hear about it again. So it's a very strange way to introduce us without any content of it, any rationale, or answering some of these puzzles that any reader then or now would want to know. And then Samuel sent all the people back to their homes. As he gathered them in the first place, Samuel gathers and Samuel sends away. This is the first time we're hearing "by it" as homes in this section here. It was a key word in the Samuel birth story and had to do with the metaphorical use of house that we'll see so many times in 2 Samuel for like the house of David, a dynastic house. Here it's literally to homes, and in contrast to what we saw in the New RSV that Saul had gone home, he had actually gone to the Bama, the high place, as we saw, but here it is "by it." And if you watched the last video, you noted that the Bayit Ab, the father's house, is the base unit for the Israelite society, with the mishpat, the family above that, and the shevet, the tribe above that, up to the nation. But now he's back in his home, and there's no Kish, so we have not heard about Kish. If readers aren't careful, you can lose track of him, and we hear nothing further about his uncle who talked to him and met him last time, if it was an uncle and not a Philistine representative. So all the people go back home, and Saul goes back to his home at Gibeah, and this will remain his home throughout. We'll see a number of times. In fact, I'll show you here all the way at the end in 26:1. Still Saul is at Gibeah with chasing down David in that rivalry. So Gibeah remains Saul's home and headquarters all the way through. And with him went, the New RSV has warriors whose hearts God had touched. But again, a little misleading. Imo Hahayil, as you can see, let's see down here. Here it's described as valiant men with him, Imo Hayil. But we'll note that Hayil was what Kish was described as in 9:1. The New RSV rendered it as a man of wealth, and I noted in that video that really that has much to do with power and military power. So here it's translated closer to that as warriors, even though Kish was translated as a wealthy person, so we'd miss this connection. And it certainly seems to suggest, as my note from myself says, or note from Brueggemann says below, it is plausible that the ones who give approval to Saul are the ones who have succeeded by the measures of worldly success, and so are judged as being blessed by God. It's also possible that these are the people, or similar to the people that Samuel invited up to the Bama for the meal in the last chapter, the local leaders who are part of Kish's circle and the people who would know Saul, and are described here in this curious phrase, whose hearts God had touched. I'm not sure of this phrase being used anywhere else, but it does match what we saw earlier in this chapter, that Saul is given a new heart. So something's going on in this that's giving interaction with God to open them up to this possibility. And if you're not familiar with that term heart in the biblical world, like much of the ancient world, it's more like the place of decision, not the place of emotion, the way we imagine it. So what's in somebody's heart is where they decide what kind of person they want to be. So we saw in the video about 10:9, those echoes from the prophets about God will put a new heart in people as a way to reorient them toward the way God wants them to go. So now Saul has people whose hearts God has touched. Notice it's Elohim here and not Yahweh, which seem to be used relatively interchangeably in this section. And so he's beginning to start organizing himself into a leader with an army. But it's going to be a little bit before that's called up, as we'll see. So the last piece we're going to look at is the beginning of verse 27. Here's some worthless fellows, it's described here, literally sons of Belial. And I created a little chart here to show you where Belial or people of Belial are used in 1st and 2nd Samuel, sometimes translated as worthless, sometimes as scoundrels, and I've mostly left the translations there so you can see the variety of them. But literally, sons of Belial is a pejorative term that has a wide range of meanings. Belial is a negative term for a demonic sort of person in some of the later literature, and it's really not clear where that would come from in ancient Israelite writings, but it certainly is a phrase, as my notes suggest, as from Brueggemann, a strongly derogatory term. And so let's look at these examples so we can put this phrase in verse 27 in some context. So Hannah said to Eli early on, "Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, as a daughter of Belial," so she doesn't want to be positioned that way. But the sons of Eli were described here as scoundrels for having no regard for Yahweh. And now then the next one is the one we're on here. Then in chapter 25, we'll hear Abigail say to David about her husband Nabal that he's so worthless that no one can speak to him. Do not take seriously this worthless fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he, and Nabal meaning fool. So there it's associated with being foolish or worthless. And then similarly, in the end of 1 Samuel, you see all the corrupt, and the word for corrupt there is the word for evil, and worthless fellows among the men who had gone with David said, because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we've recovered. So there is the narrator's commentary on their failure to share with their fellow soldiers. And so just a little editorial judgment there. Notice the difference of when it's an editorial judgment and when it's a character's judgment. Then in 2 Samuel, we'll hear one person call David a scoundrel, and the narrator calls somebody else a scoundrel. So in chapter 16, we'll see Shammai shouted to David while he cursed, out, out, murderer, scoundrel, while David is leaving Jerusalem, escaping from his son Absalom's rebellion. And Shammai is plainly on the side of Absalom. They're declaring David publicly a scoundrel, which could have gotten him killed but didn't, and we'll get there when we get there. And then the narrator turns it on Sheba, son of Bichri, note a Benjaminite, who said, we have no portion in David, no share in the son of Jesse. A quote that we'll hear again when Solomon's son Rehoboam takes over and Jeroboam leads a rebellion of Israel against Judah, the monarchy in Judah. So this saying no share in David is deemed from the Deuteronomistic authors a bad thing, and so his leading Israel away from the Jerusalem monarchy makes him a son of Belial. And then the last two are in poetic places, these psalms that are in the end of 2 Samuel attributed to David here. And so we hear one translated as the torrents of perdition, so in an abstract sense, not about people in particular. And then finally, simply described as godless. So hopefully you can see a pattern there. It's either people who are rejecting God or rejecting something that the author, at least, or the narrator within the author's world deems as contrary to what God is leading people to. So these people respond, how can this man save us? And we'll see that it's answered later in chapter 11 after the first battle. So it's a pregnant question now that will be answered later. And we noted last video I provided you the chart of the uses of yesh here as save, and so that was one of it, and we'll see a number in this section. But it's a fair question. Even though the narrator condemns these as sons of Belial, it is a fair question about how this small-town farmer is going to be the one to save people. He has no military experience, contrary to David, who will at least claim he has experience fighting lions and bears as a shepherd boy, but we don't know that Saul has any experience at all, other than the fact that his father seems to be a powerful man. So it says they despised him and brought him no present. The word for despised here, from the root buz here, is a very negative word, and I didn't provide a chart of it, but you can see there's several examples of where it comes up. And sometimes it's about despising character, sometimes it's about despising God, as we'll see. It's a very strong word, though. And it says they brought him no present. And one of the issues was, were they supposed to? Nobody else seemed to. The whole crowd of Israel, before Samuel dismissed them, simply proclaimed, long live the king. But there was no ceremony, there was no meal, there was no celebration. They said, long live the king, and Samuel dismissed them to go home. So a rather desultory celebration, contrary to what we'll see in other ones, where there's, as you'd expect, with a new king, especially with the first king, a huge celebration with food and drinking and dancing and all those kinds of things. The present here certainly represents an acknowledgement. Perhaps it's anticipating tribute. Minha is a broad word for bringing some kind of gift or present. It's not the everyday word for a tribute, as we'll see when Solomon is king and other kings give him tribute to acknowledge his power in the region. But there's not much of a region here. To remind us here, this whole thing is taking place in this small area. And if we zoom out, you can see what a little piece it is out of the wider area of what we think of as Israel, as at least this purple part, not the Transjordan part over here. So all this is taking place in this, here in Mizpah and here in Gibeah. And so it's not exactly like Saul is taking on the leadership of a grand region. He's more still like a local chieftain until he's tested. And in the next scene, we'll see how he's set up to be tested. We'll pick it up then. See you then. Bye-bye.